So for my presentation today, I'm going to talk about the piece Vexations by French composer Erik Satie. So in this presentation, I'll just have a brief look at who Erik Satie is, a bit of his background. I'm going to look at the piece, which is called Vexations, and kind of analyse the music theory within it, or the lack thereof, as you'll soon see. And I'll talk about the concepts of creative process, affect and meaning. So why did he compose this piece? How did it make the listeners and the musician feel when playing it? And at the end, I am going to have an attempt at performing it. Wow. Yeah. So, Erik Satie, 17th of May 1866 to 1st of July 1925. So he's a French composer known for being kind of at the bottom end, but at the top end because he's great, but it was early, in modernism and minimalism. So he was like the first person to kind of introduce those kind of things. So he invented something called furniture music, or in French, musique d'emblement, and essentially that's just background music. So prior to that, people would write music and then they'll have an audience and they'll play the music and the audience would be listening and watching. Whereas Satie kind of coined the idea that you would have music and everyone else is eating, not really paying much attention, it's just kind of in the background. So he did have a really big influence on avant-garde musicians such as John Cage about 50, 60, 100 years later. And you might recognise his piece Hymne Pédé and the Nocturnes, which I've just handed around the sheet music for. So you probably will recognise this. So he actually came up with these words, they have they're references to something, but I can't remember what it was. Do you guys know it? It's beautiful. And this kind of harmony at the time was unheard of, really. I think it's like a major 7 to a major 7, which So in terms of his creative process, I'll kind of look at who he was as a person. So he was known to be quite eccentric. He did study music, but he didn't bother to graduate because he didn't really appreciate being confined to all of these specific kind of forms and functions, and he wanted to kind of do his own thing. And in that same kind of realm, he was working at a church, but again didn't like how they boxed him in, so he created his own religion in order to be able to play the music that he wanted to play. He was good friends with Claude Debussy, who wrote Clair de Lune, and they had influence on each other. And yeah, he created his own compositional system. And yeah, he chose to live simply and was often short of money and actually died in poverty. He's kind of like Picasso in the sense that he wasn't really found or realised or appreciated in his lifetime. It wasn't until afterwards when people saw how important his music was and how much that was good in the society. So I've just got an excerpt here from his Memoirs of an Amnesiac, first published in 1913. So this just kind of shows how eccentric and weird he is. So an artist must regulate his life. Here is my precise daily schedule. Dinner is served at 7:16 and finished at 7:20. Afterwards, from 8:09 to 9:59, symphonic readings out loud. I go to bed regularly at 10:37. Once a week, I wake up at a start of 3:14 a.m. Tuesdays. I have a good appetite, but never talk when eating for fear of strangling. Being of serious demeanour, it is unintentional when I laugh. I always apologise very affably. Yeah, and he also, for 10 years, he wore the same corduroy, so he bought 7 suits. They were a corduroy, tan-coloured velvet, and it's the only thing he wore. Just went through those same 7 suits for 10 years. And he often created his own kind of personas. Like there was another one where he just had an umbrella and a bowler hat, and that was him for 3 or 4 years. So the piece itself, Vexations. So that French writing up there, it says, in order to play the motif 840 times in succession, it would be advisable to prepare oneself beforehand and in the deepest silence by serious immobilities. So that's basically saying you have to play this song piece 840 times, no distractions, one after the other, just continue. And in that, it is vexing, which is kind of the name of the piece. So vexation means to irritate or to torment. Because that's kind of what this piece makes you feel. It's how it's created, really. So if you look at the theory itself, there's no time signature, there's no bar lines, which is kind of what that piece there, Nossi ends is. You can see, and he's got some instructions on there that say things like strive for a hollow effect, whatever that means when you're playing. So it's up for interpretation. It's also got enharmonic notation. So you've got your A and your E flat there, and there could be like a G, there's not, but there could be a G sharp and a D sharp, and you're playing the same thing, but it makes it very frustrating as a musician when you're reading it. There's no functional harmony, so they're all diminished chords. There's one augmented chord, so it doesn't fit into traditional harmonic functionality. So the theme, which is this at the bottom here, that consists of every single note of the chromatic scale, except for G sharp or A flat, and so the structure. So this is a theme, you play that once, and then you play A1, and then you play that again, and then you play A2. And the top line and the bottom line are actually exactly the same. The only difference is that your chords are inverted in the right hand. And they're tritones too. Effect on the listener. So diminished chords, as we know as musicians, diminished chords don't give any sense of resolution. So listening to it 840 times, you'd think, oh, it's just constant vexing nature of it. However, once you play it a lot, it actually ends up having a different effect and becomes really meditative. And it's quite nice, and you're kind of just floating. And it switches things around. So if you're listening to a performer playing it, they'll be playing it up to their 202nd time, and then they accidentally play a wrong note, it often will play a much more melodic harmony. And then you're like, oh, what was that? That was a resolved chord. That's not right. So yeah, I love this piece. And the effect on the player. So again, like because of that enharmonic notation, when you're learning it, even though you're playing the same thing you played 3 beats ago, you spend so long trying to figure out what the chord was, and you're like, oh shit, I just played that. Very frustrating. It disrupts pattern recognition, so when you're learning it off by heart, it's very difficult. And that's that tritone chord inversions between, oh, it's not there anymore, between the first and the second. It confuses your muscle memory because you're used to playing one thing and then suddenly it's the same but the other way around. And yeah, so again, once this piece is memorised, its meditative effect can make it a really introspective and rewarding experience, and that was my experience of it. So this is just a wee clip of Philip Corner. He's a composer and pianist.
You have to maintain a state of concentration. Traditional Western music, once you learn it, it's almost you go on automatic and you just feel yourself playing the Beethoven concerto or Schumann piece or something like that. You've studied all the harmonies and you know, and you get the themes, and it's just going by itself, and you can't do that with this piece. As soon as you kind of just let yourself go like that, your hand goes to some place where it shouldn't be going. So there's a sense of deep concentration that I think is maybe the underlying meaning of the piece.
And so that brings us to meaning. So not actually much is known about his intentions when writing this piece, because it wasn't published, it wasn't played, it wasn't even mentioned during his lifetime. So it wasn't until John Cage published it, you know, at 60, 70 years later before people really knew about it. But there is speculation based on his kind of weird personality. A lot of people think, well, maybe it was a rebuttal or parody to conventional styles of harmony, and kind of like, I don't have to fit in this box, I can play what I want. A therapeutic distraction from intrusive thoughts, which, you know, it helps you keep that focus. You've got to play, and that is an exercise in concentration and memory. So I'm going to have an attempt at performing it now.